In the wake of the United States' entrance into World War II, one fort in a quiet Montana town played a pivotal role.
One of the first lists that we found was a list of almost 1,000 of the Italian seamen who were brought here.
He said they looked and they saw the beautiful mountain and the sun and the clouds and oh, che bella vista, which is what a beautiful, beautiful view.
Over 2,000 Italians and American Japanese were detained during the war, and their stories were, for decades, untold and cast in the shadows of American history.
The reaction of Americans and human beings when they are faced with threat is frequently one that we are somewhat ashamed of after we look at it in a historical context.
It's a really significant place where our country's commitment to civil liberties was tested and I think failed.
In the late 1800s, the United States government, concerned about Indian uprisings across the western region, constructed Fort Missoula on the Bitterroot River near Missoula. Built as an open fort, the tactic to ward off uprisings proved unnecessary, and Fort Missoula shuffled through a number of purposes before becoming inactive in the 1920s.
Then in the 1930s, the fort was remissioned with being a regional headquarters for the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. So the fort had all the infrastructure that was necessary to sustain a large operation with a large number of people.
After the outbreak of World War II in Europe, Americans were adamant to stay neutral and isolate themselves from the conflict.
We want no war. We'll have no war, save in defense of our own people or our own honor.
Before we'd ever even entered World War II, the United States was trying to help England and promising the American people who were isolationists that if we helped England, we would not have to enter the war ourselves.
Planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
To aid the Allies' efforts without entering the war, President Roosevelt created the Lend-Lease Act. This program gave the U.S. the ability to remain neutral in law and serve interests to defeat Germany without officially entering the war. German and Italian sea merchant ships docked at American ports were seized, and the crew were detained under the Alien Detention Act. After some time at Ellis Island, the men were marshaled and sent to military forts in the West.
They were trying to make the point that they weren't prisoners of war because we were not at war with Italy. So they picked two places, one being Fort Missoula and the other being in Bismarck, North Dakota at Fort Lincoln. And they sent all of the Italians to Fort Missoula and all of the Germans to Fort Lincoln.
On May 9, 1941, the first train arrived at Fort Missoula with 1,000 Italian civilians.
So when we arrived over here, this was a summer. So after you spend like 3 weeks in jail and maybe 3 more weeks in Ellis Island, and you arrive in Missoula, to me this was a paradise.
He said they looked and they saw the beautiful mountain and the sun and the clouds and oh, che bella vista, which is what a beautiful, beautiful view.
No longer an open fort, the grounds were fenced in. Renovated administration buildings, a hospital, a mess hall, new barracks, and spacious grounds were now managed under the Department of Justice Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS. As part of managing the camp, the INS Border Patrol also guarded the camp.
This building is a building that was used by the CCC and by the internment camp as a major warehouse and facility for dealing with clothing. When you figure out that you have over 2,000 people here who have to be clothed and you have to do their laundry, you need a big building to do that in.
While at Bella Vista, the Italians sought to make the best of their internment by creating opportunities for recreation, the arts, and worship. Through a limited self-government that regulated their daily lives, the Italians divided chores and labor. They were even paid a small wage for their efforts. While a majority of the Italian men were from a number of different ships, Alfredo Cipolato worked in the Italian pavilion as a waiter during the 1940 World's Fair in New York City. Because he was not allowed to travel back to Italy, Alfredo's visa expired and he was arrested and held at Ellis Island before being transported to Fort Missoula.
It's very hard to tell about, because we were just thinking, planning, worried because, the war, no way to have any news, from home. That's the only thing our worry was. But same time, it was not too bad.
He was grateful in a way to be here because he was safe from fighting in a war. But he said, remember, it was a prison and we couldn't leave and we had no contact with our family.
These are the orchestra from the ship, and they did provide concerts and operas, even performed operas for the community here in Missoula, to which people were invited, and to other social events. And of course, informal singing and music was also a very important part of sort of day-to-day life for the Italians.
Even though the men were imprisoned at Fort Missoula, they were allowed to participate in supervised work activities outside the fort, such as picking cherries near Flathead Lake, forestry work, and railroad work. These activities provided an escape from the fort's day-to-day monotony, and in some cases, such as Cipolato's, a chance to meet the Missoula women.
I met my wife after when I joined the San Francis Xavier church choir, and she was the secretary of the choir. And one day she heard me sing, la 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 la, and she come over. She said, "Oh, a beautiful, che bella voce." She said in Italian. It was the first time I hear somebody speak in Italian since I was in Missoula.
My dad had a beautiful voice, and he sang at the church choir at the Catholic Church. That's where he met my mom. And October 5th, 1943, they got married. They must have had a very powerful connection, and it never dwindled in all the years they were married.
They had a little Italian market grocery, which is at the corner of Broadway and Madison for many, many years. And that was really kind of an icon in Missoula. So Alfredo was also another person who everybody knew he'd come here during the war, but not everybody knew his story.
While being detained at Fort Missoula, the men were protected under the Geneva Convention, an international agreement that stated humane rules protecting from torture, abuse, force of labor, cruel and unusual punishment, and inadequate living conditions. This meant they cooked and ate 3 meals a day, which was sometimes better than the Missoulians' wartime rations. If they chose to work outside the fort, they were paid fairly, and they were allowed to practice their own religion and beliefs. The Catholic Diocese of Helena played a pivotal role in helping get Italians placed in a variety of jobs outside the fort.
The treatment of these civilians is very important to the United States because Americans, civilians, are being held behind lines in both Germany and later in Japan. And so the Geneva Convention is extremely important to the management of this camp. The Japanese and Italians that came to Fort Missoula lived in barracks. There were 29 of these put together. They're actually modular units from the Army. They bolt together up in the corners. They had central heating, and each of them held approximately 38 to 40 men who lived in them.
The comfort from harm the Italians enjoyed did not immunize them from boredom and anxiety. The self-sufficient lives they led, days of cooking, playing soccer and bocce, and cohabitating, would soon change.
I ask
since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
I can remember when I was in San Francisco, it was Sunday morning, late morning, when we got the word, and it was unbelievable. I remember asking my father, I said, what happened and why? My father saying, I don't know. It was just a total surprise. I think that's a sentiment of almost everyone in the West Coast of Japanese ancestry. They were just shocked and very concerned about what's going to happen to us.
As soon as the bombs were dropped on Pearl Harbor, the United States was thrust into the war.
Prior to Pearl Harbor, J. Edgar Hoover directed the FBI to coordinate an ABC list of insidious enemies. The men on these lists were influential people in the Japanese community, whom the government thought were likely to be disloyal if the United States was to go to war against Japan. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, those on the ABC list were arrested by the FBI, taken from their homes, stripped of their possessions, and separated from their families without a hint of where they were going or if they'd be seen again.
One of the major differences in how the Missoula community and the United States reacts differently to the Italians, Germans, and the Japanese is an issue of really racism. Because the Italians and the Germans are European, Christian, look like us, they are really not perceived as being threatening in that regard. And because of that, many of the men who are on the West Coast and come here are not American citizens, although they've lived in the United States for decades. They're not allowed to be citizens, so they are citizens by definition of Japan, and we are now at war with Japan.
Even doing something that was perfectly normal by American standards, but the FBI thought might make you suspicious in some ways, and those people were the people who ended up being sent to Fort Missoula.
In contrast to the Italian men's springtime arrival to Fort Missoula, the Japanese arrived to the fort in the dead of the cold Montana winter. The Italian and Japanese detainees not only differed in culture, but in age, health, and language. Many of the men were elderly, averaging 60 years of age, and many had chronic or acute health problems. While being detained, 4 Japanese men died due to health-related problems. Masuo Yasui, a Hood River orchardist, was one of the elder detainees sent to Fort Missoula. Yasui arrived from Japan in 1903. A prominent businessman in Hood River, Oregon, Yasui built his success from operating a mercantile store and owning orchards. Because of his success, he was one of the men on the FBI's ABC list and arrested on December 12, 1941. His personal assets were frozen, his future uncertain.
I must have been aware of the fact that something bad like I suspected was going to happen, and indeed it was beginning to happen then. We just didn't know how bad it was going to be until my father disappeared. When I say disappeared, to me he disappeared because I came home, he's gone, Mom didn't know where he went.
I kept saying, where are you going? Where are you going? They said, and I got no response. And I thought, I had heard, you know, that they were either shot, they were sent to Japan, or where did they go? And that to me was the most terrifying thing, not to know where he was going.
The people on these lists were typically people who were leaders of the community, business owners, heads of Japanese religious groups. There were the heads of banks, the editors of newspapers, people with influence and education in Japan that would be considered highly suspicious and therefore dangerous.
By mid-January, there were 1,000 Japanese held at Fort Missoula. The government decided that the best way to handle that was to decide through hearings whether they were likely to be disloyal. which is a really interesting concept, how you prove whether someone might commit a crime.
The fates of the Japanese at Fort Missoula were determined by alien enemy hearing boards comprised of citizens selected by the Justice Department. Their task was to question each of the men individually to determine which were dangerous enemy aliens.
I remember vividly to this day, the FBI agents were presenting maps of the Panama Canal. These particular maps of the Panama Canal were rather childish, but they showed in detail how the locks work. They were found in our home, Dad's home, and they were saying that, you know, this certainly points to a very insidious plot to do something against the Panama Canal. And Dad was saying, look, these maps were drawn by our children as part of their schoolwork, and indeed they were, because it was either my brother or sisters or somebody who had drawn these particular maps, but the accusation was made that this is evidence that you had some nefarious design against the Panama Canal. Dad was saying, no, 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 and the prosecution was saying, well, we think it is. If you didn't plan to blow up the Panama Canal, prove that you didn't intend to. Now, it's impossible, obviously, to prove a negative fact.
Now, in the end, they were not found to be disloyal and were not found to be doing anything that was illegal, but that did not deter them from being held for the remainder of the war.
Despite the fact that these Japanese men were not found to be disloyal, the hearings clenched control over the men's fate. Kept apart from their families, most of the men were transferred from Fort Missoula to Army internment camps or other Department of Justice camps. Others were paroled and allowed to join their families in War Relocation Authority camps.
I know that the people who were here at Fort Missoula were quite concerned. When they started segregating people to go to different camps from Missoula, there were concerns that maybe some of them are going to a place where they would be executed, and therefore it was a tough time for a lot of people.
This is the courtroom that's been restored to look as it did back in 1941 and 42 when the loyalty hearings were held here for the Japanese that were held at Fort Missoula. In 1938, the Army reconstructed this building, which was a chapel, a very large chapel, into being their administrative headquarters. And in there, as the Army, they needed a courtroom for court-martials. So this room was actually built as a room in which to hold hearings for court-martials. So it doesn't look much like a courtroom might look that has a jury box, etc., because juries aren't involved in court-martials, and nor were they involved in the loyalty hearings for the Japanese. The hearing board sat at the bench, and the other participants were down here at a table.
Despite their cultural differences, the close proximity of the Italians and Japanese led to limited interaction between the two communities. A need for social interaction led the Italians to games like bocce and soccer, while the Japanese preferred golf, baseball, and creating works of art made of polished stones.
The obsession of the Japanese that's here is polishing stones. The Japanese men, while they were walking along the river and all, would find these beautiful pebbles, and they had taken to polish them to a high sheen and turning them into various art projects. So this is called stone fever, and they write pretty extensively about their passion for turning these rocks and pebbles into various art forms.
We did see one thing where they tried to make a pretty rudimentary golf course. I mean, it's really nothing like a golf course you'd see today or even in those days, but they were given golf clubs, so they were able to go out and do that.
You'll see in front of this barrack sort of a garden. This was fairly common for the internees who lived here, is that they would plant small gardens in front of their barracks. So we will see in many of the photographs pictures of iris or vegetables or flowers being planted by both the Japanese and the Italians who lived here.
Yasui, the once prominent Hood River businessman, was transferred to an army camp in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And then in 1943, he was sent to yet another INS camp in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and barred from reuniting with his family until 5 months after the war ended.
By then, his wife had been able to get out of the WRA camps. but they didn't feel as if they could return to their home in Hood River because the citizens of Hood River really turned on the Yasuis. It was horrible and racist, and they just felt they couldn't return home.
Nobody ever told my father, as far as I know, welcome back, Matt Yasui, we were wrong, we misjudged you, come on back and become a member of the board of directors of the Apple Growers Association again, become a Rotarian again. He felt differently, and because he felt differently, he couldn't go back there.
Yasui never fully recovered from the prejudice and confinement during World War II. He committed suicide in 1957, a few years after obtaining American citizenship.
Most people know something about Manzanar and Minidoka and the removal from the west coast of 120,000 Japanese Americans, but they know almost nothing about this particular history of the Department of Justice camps because it was such a small number of people, and because the men often, when they were sent off to join their family, did not talk about it. And their children, because they were raised in, say, Manzanar, never came here, and so they didn't know anything about this camp. So it's really quite a surprise, even to many of their descendants, to find out that their father was held here for a period of time.
The Department of Justice closed Fort Missoula on July 1st, 1944. This signaled a new era for Fort Missoula and a closed chapter for the Japanese and Italian detainees. The remaining Japanese men were sent to the Department of Justice camp in Santa Fe. Beginning with Italy's surrender in September 1943, some of the Italian men went back to Italy. Others joined the American military to stay in the U.S., and some even got married to American women. Thanks to the preservation of Fort Missoula and dedicated historians, the fort continues to peel back layers of a story that was, for many years, untold.
What is so startling about Fort Missoula's internment camp is it is intact. It is the most intact internment camp from World War II in the United States.
Today, the fort remains a window to the past regarding human rights and an open gateway to the future in understanding America's reaction to conflict.
And so for that reason, I think the history of Fort Missoula helps current people to understand something of what happens to us as a people when we're faced with threat, and how we often react in ways that are really cruel, illegal, immoral. We did it to Native Americans, we've done it to Asians, we've done it to Arab Americans. I mean, it is part of the history of this country and something that I think we need to always be aware of and be on guard against.
So, did we learn anything? I'm not sure. I hope so, when there's a period where people are calmer and have more time to reflect. But in times of crisis, I think people revert to giving into their fears, and sometimes those are stereotypes about people and where they came from or what they look like. And I think that's the lesson of Fort Missoula, but whether it's a lesson we've learned, I really can't say.